The mattress is soft, and there are hangers in the closet and stationery with Bates Motel printed on it, in case you want to make your friends back home envious. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa.
And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. It's only a few weeks into the new year, 2025, so join us as we check into a vacation from hell in our new series, all about the horror of the motel.
All right, listeners. So I am going to kick us off in our discussion. And as Matt just told us, we are going to be doing a new series of a few episodes about horror in hotels, motels, all sorts of kind of these liminal spaces that we use when we travel. And so the first thing that we're going to do is, like we typically do in these series, is talk a little bit about why we think this particular trope or this particular theme is scary or scares us. And, one of the things we were talking about before we hit record is that this is something that, if you really think about it, goes pretty far back in literature, because there's usually, in Gothic stories and otherwise, people traveling somewhere and they have to stop along the way. But then there's also movies and books throughout the history of horror and the supernatural that focus on certain places. And I think we can all think of, the Base Motel. If you go back to Lisa's introduction that she gave us, there is probably the one that pops into people's heads most readily. So when I was thinking about the new theme of the motel or the hotel, there were several things that came to my mind about why it scares us. And so I'll share a couple things and then pass it off to you, Lisa, and Matt, and see what you think. But for me, I think it's the way that the motel or hotel is kind of liminal or in between and uncanny at the same time, I guess, if that makes sense. So when you're traveling somewhere else, you're leaving your home and what seems safe and familiar, and you're not always going for a vacation or whatever. Sometimes you're going for a work reason, or maybe something bad has happened that you're traveling for. So people travel for all sorts of reasons. Maybe they're up to no good. We don't know. And you're staying somewhere very temporary along the way. So it's an in between space, which in my mind can be very isolating. So you could be in a hotel or motel or a cabin in the woods that you're renting as a place to stay in a transient kind of manner and be isolated. But you could also be in a large hotel in a city and still seem kind of isolated, because you're not home and you're not where you're going to either. And there's something kind of uncertain about that in between space, especially if you're traveling by yourself. But even if you're traveling with other people, I think there's still something isolating about that. And then the other thing I think is the uncanny of it, that a hotel room is a bedroom, it's a bathroom, it kind of replicates those smaller kind of private spaces from your home, but it's not really private. You probably got somebody in the room right next to you and people walking by in the hall. So there's something kind of like comforting about it. You can go back there and it's a space for you to kind of relax, and do whatever. It's your space temporarily for that point. But you also have all these strangers and people around you that you don't know what they're doing. And that can add, I think, a feeling of unease as well, in addition to that isolation of traveling. So it's kind of like the mixed purposes or mixed feelings of being in this space that you feel should be kind of a safe little break space for you as you're traveling, but also knowing that it's a completely new place to you and you don't know what the motivations of the other people are around you. Um, thinking of course, Psycho and kind of the invasion of that space. So those were just a couple of things that I thought about that make hotels and motels scary. But the more I thought about it, the more stuff I came up with. They're really creepy settings to use in things that are supposed to be scary. What about you guys? What are some of the things that you think about when you think about the fear of a hotel or a motel?
Well, like you, I had kind of thought that hotels really do fit in this kind of liminal space of it's home, but it's not home. It's the place where we're doing all the things we would do in home. We sleep, we shower, we whatever, but it's not our home. Um, I think also just the idea that I don't know, it was funny, Mel, because as you were describing it, you were describing this like a hotel as being like a transient space, right? But we are almost I was almost looking at it the opposite way, like that we are the transient things going into hotels because you think about it, a lot of hotels, especially, I mean, maybe not the Bates Motel because there are lots of vacancies there, but most like hotels, motels, places like that, they're going to do a quick turnover on the room. So somebody was in there the night probably before you came in. There was somebody that morning brushing their teeth in the sink before you come in and like drop your stuff. And then you leave and somebody else comes in. So it's this kind of like rotating space of humanity, which is really strange. There was that, and I'm going to forget it now. The actual name of it, but it was that, maybe one of you can help me out. It was on, I think it was on HBO a few years ago that the Duplass, Mark Duplass did. It was like room something. I can't, my brain is broken right now. So listeners, I'm sorry, but I'll remember it in a minute. Anyway, um, but it was basically where it was the same room, the same set, but each like episode of the TV show was a different person who was in that room at the time. And so it kind of it spanned genres really, in a really neat way. And I think that's kind of interesting because when you get so many different personalities and so many different people coming through a room, there's going to be different things happening in there, different emotions being felt. Sometimes, Mel, as you pointed out, it's going to be like nefarious things happening, and so it's. I think they're really weird spaces in general. But then, Mel, you also mentioned like the uncanniness of it. And most of the time, when on this podcast, when we've talked about the uncanny valley, we've talked about things like clowns and robots and, things that are like supposed to be human, but don't quite measure up. And that's where that kind of uncanny feeling sets in of how, when you kind of get weirded out or creeped out by it. And hotels have always been that space for me too, because, they're usually decorated so blandly. I mean, and when I say like hotel wall art, everybody knows what I'm talking about, but it's just this kind of like very bland, not meant to evoke really any kind of strong emotion in anything. Very pale colors usually, but I don't know. It's just it's lifeless, in a weird way. Often when I think about hotels too, sometimes I think about those like labyrinthine like hallways where it's the feeling of walking down kind of an endless hallway and there's just being doors everywhere. And um I don't know, there's a lot in hotels that I think if I let my brain really go down that road, um I'm gonna talk myself out of ever staying in one again. I mean, and that's not even to mention like the real life horrors. The fact that, sometimes I think about like, oh my God, am I gonna get bed bugs from this place? Or, did they clean it properly? Or did somebody die in here and I don't know? And just all those like things that your brain can go to. Um, so yeah, I think a hotel, I think it is a prime space for horror, and I would love to see more people explore that space in the horror genre.
Well, I guess it's my turn. um, I was going to say, first of all, as the resident germaphobe, yes, I also think of those things as well. the, oh my gosh, somebody was probably just in this bedroom that I'm now sleeping in. Did they change the sheets? Did they wash the sheets? Did they clean the bathtub and the sink and all of this stuff? Probably not thoroughly. And I'll just say this as well. My wife spent several years working for a hotel, and I've heard some stories, but I specifically requested not to hear too many because I did not need to know how the sausage was made. So I'll just leave it at that. Let you all kind of fill in those gaps. But I agree with both of you about this uncanniness of the hotel, that it's meant to evoke a space that we're used to, a safe space, even a bedroom with a bathroom. But I think you hit the nail on the head, Lisa, about saying that it's lifeless. It's like a wax figure as opposed to a real person. It's there and it looks real, but the more you look at it, the more details. It's like, well, they got close to making this like what a bedroom would be, but it's just kind of soulless. It's just, yeah, it just is. And I think one thing that neither of you mentioned that is probably an important thing for both hotels, motels, whatever. I've stayed at a number of them throughout my life, and you see it sometimes in movies, but I've never seen one in real life where there's more than one exit from the room. You get in and out through that door, and it's either in the hall in a hotel or external on the wall of a motel, but there is no other way out usually. There's no back window, there's no nothing. So if nothing else, it is very easy to be trapped in one. You know, if there's somebody blocking the doorway, two people doing whatever, robbing you, attacking you, what, God knows what. Yeah, I mean that automatically just limits your ability to run, defend, and evade them. So I think that's another aspect to it, the almost claustrophobic nature of it, if you let yourself think about it. I mean, obviously the rooms are usually big enough that they don't feel claustrophobic, but if you start thinking about it in terms of exits, I think that's another factor that can be used, and I'm sure it has been used in horror stories set in hotels and motels and whatnot. And just to add that and kind of double back on something you both said as well, I think another really scary aspect is that you really know nothing about the people around you, like whatsoever. You don't know who's staying in the room next to you. You don't know anything about the staff, who are, in most cases, some of them are coming into the room during your stay if you're there for more than one day to clean the room, unless you put that uh, not disturb sign up. They'll, housekeeping will come in and make the beds and refresh the towels, all of that. So you've got people coming into your room even while it's there in your space, and then nothing about anything about anyone um, staying there or working there. And I obviously, I'm sure we're going to talk Psycho at some point, both in passing and in detail. But I think that's a big part of the horror of that movie, is that, I mean, the innkeeper is supposed to be a safe person because you're going into their space. And um, anyway, yeah, that's kind of rambling, but those are kind of my thoughts there.
I was just gonna say that I didn't I hadn't really thought about it, Matt, until you said something that there is so much trust that we put in the people like who run these hotels. Um just well, I mean, and to a degree, like the people who are staying around us, but you know, when you're on a road trip and you check into like a Holiday Inn or whatever, I don't know. You're not expecting the Bates Motel, right? I mean, there is so much trust that we put in without even thinking about it, without even giving it second thought. And I think about it more when I do these like Airbnb stays, which, horror is kind of catching up to that kind of uncanniness of staying in somebody's house. I mean, certainly the movie Barbarian kind of played with that idea. But just when we're talking about like just hotels in general, most of us don't really spend too much time thinking about that innkeeper figure. Um, but we do put a lot of trust into that. And that's a little scary when you think, well, what happens when that isn't there anymore?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of vulnerability that you were hitting on, Matt. And I hadn't really thought, I mean, obviously the idea of someone invading that space is terrifying. But when you really think about it, like you were doing in your take about the fact that there's only one exit, it adds an extra layer of, yeah, I mean, claustrophobia. Because like if something does happen, anything happens, it's not as easy to get out. And then that's, I guess, amplified when you think about it, by the fact that they're always telling you what your exits are, on the door. um but no, the idea of, I think, being surrounded by people that you don't know if you can trust them or not is an important thing to think about in that kind of situation. Another thing I was thinking about when you were talking, Lisa, is you were talking about all the people who come in and out all the time. And it made me think of the phenomenon of, the large, almost like Gothic mansion type hotels that we have in horror. These like historic hotels are either haunted, and that's why people are going to check it out, like tourists, or it's like not supposedly not haunted, but is. There's something like a labyrinth, like maze like about it, that could be manipulated against you, more isolation or confusion. You have all the trappings of the Gothic castle, right? The tons of decor and just completely like, covered over with artwork, carving, whatever, especially getting these really older kind of historic hotels. And also just the fact of parts of the hotel that you're never going to see as a person who's there, like almost like an upstairs downstairs type thing, which can also be a little creepy. Like there's a whole other part to it that you're not privy to or know about. um and I think that lends the constant turnover of people and the history of those hotels that have been around so long. People die. And so just like houses get haunted because people died, like, 15, 20, 25, 100 years ago in it, hotels are going to have deaths in them too. And so I think there's so much about them that just make them perfect receptacles for spirits and ghosts in horror, I would think, as well, because you're always going to have like that room where so and so died, or that room where the tragedy happened that people don't want to stay in now, or maybe they do. So all those aspects of how houses go bad or get haunted are kind of amplified, I would think, in hotels, because there's just all the emotions, all the things that happened, all the kind of just violent ends that people can come to. That's where a lot of your hotel ghost stories come from.
You know, it makes me wonder, how many hotel like, if ghosts are real, I mean, if we buy that concept of a haunted house, I would think that would mean that there would be more haunted hotels than there would be haunted houses. I mean, just by playing just the statistics of it, um, it would seem to me. But I mean, that's also a thing, right? That's a thing where people will go and they'll go to they'll find the most haunted hotels in the world. Um, I mean, it's certainly worked for places like the Stanley, right? I mean, I know that Stephen King helped a lot with that, boosting it by, saying he experienced something there, and that's what inspired him, to create the Overlook in The Shining. But I mean, that is a thing now where people are going deliberately to find these haunted hotels and to stay in the particular rooms that are the most haunted. And I mean, it is a I guess it would fit under dark tourism. This idea of people wanting to seek out haunted hotels and stay there. Um, I will say, for however uncanny they are, I've stayed in several supposedly haunted hotels, and I haven't seen a thing. So I don't know if that says more about me or the phenomenon of haunted hotels. I don't know, but we'll see. Well, we have kind of covered a little bit about why hotels and motels are um so perfect for the horror genre. And we thought, because this is the first of a series. We are going to talk, I think, more in depth about particular, we'll get into particular haunted hotels. For instance, Psycho is going to be one that we're going to talk about more in depth. But we thought we could just kind of give a brief overview of the history of haunted hotels. And prior to this recording, we kind of went back and forth about what constituted as a hotel in horror. Because if you look in a lot of the early Gothics in particular, even up through Mel, you mentioned like Frankenstein and Dracula, those kind of have some hotel spaces in those. Dracula in particular kind of feels to me like that, because you have Jonathan Harker like traveling to go to Dracula's castle. But even then, like the small instances of like inns or something that happens along the way were so small. And then once he's in Dracula's castle, even though that's not his home, and it does kind of fit into that, a lot of the like uncanny valley of what we were talking about, of like staying in somebody else's house. It's not quite a hotel. So we had to get kind of a little nitpicky here. The first real instance I could find was a Wilkie Collins story called actually The Haunted Hotel. And it's kind of a ghost slash mystery story that's set in England. And it's it's got like a countess and a lord, and they're like supposed to be getting married, and then he jilts her, and all this kind of doom and gloom, and that sort of thing. But they stay in, well, there's this like decaying palace. So there's your Gothic place right there, but it gets turned into this like fashionable hotel. And so then you have all these like ghostly happenings going on, which Wilkie Collins is really good at doing. So we do have that. That was really the first, I think, instance in, at least in the English language, that I could find. I'm sure there's stories elsewhere. But that was in 1878. So that was the first kind of like English slash American one that I could find that would really, I think, fit what we would consider a hotel. Um, and then, I mean, of course, you have like Psycho, which the movie, I think, especially 1960, really kind of stands out. But really, we don't get any really good hotel horror until we enter the Stephen King era, because he actually did play with the idea of hotels and motels, I think, really well. Um, so of course we have The Shining, The Overlook. There was 1408, which first came out in 1999, and then it was eventually collected into Everything's Eventual in that collection in 2002. There was also a film in 2007. I'm pretty sure he did other ones. Those were the two that popped into my head. I don't know, when you're dealing especially with something that's just like a haunted space, a lot of times people tend to go towards houses. Um, and I really thought it was interesting that he also kind of played with the hotel space more than anybody else. Um, and you guys can jump in if you think I'm forgetting some of these. These are just kind of the eras that I was finding in the timeline here. So you kind of have the Stephen King era. Then in the 2000s, there were, I think, trends in the horror, especially in the American horror movie space, um, where I'm calling it the hostile horror era, where you had like the Eli Roth, um, you know, kids traveling abroad, bad things are gonna happen when they check into the hotel. Same thing was that there was that movie like Turistas. Um, and I do remember it now. The TV show I was trying to remember, kind of taking us up to more recent times, was HBO's Room 104, which it all takes place, like I said, in the same room. And it's not necessarily hauntings, but it does kind of play with that idea of just kind of the creepiness and the eeriness of a room kind of attracting different people. Um, so those were kind of the main highlights. I don't know, am I forgetting any like majorly important haunted hotels or just hotels in general um where bad things happen in horror stories or horror movies? Because, again, I kept thinking there was a lot of the, like, people going to stay at somebody else's house and something bad happening, which kinda has that feel, but not exactly a hotel specific. Um, because for a while I was thinking, I was like, "I don't know, does Misery count?" That has that same feel to it. But again, it's somebody's house. It's not necessarily a hotel room where the horror is happening. Of course, there was American Horror Stories hotel, um, but those were kind of uh, the major signposts, I guess, if we're laying out the history of the haunted hotel.
I want to jump in and add another name. I don't know if major is a word to describe it, but when I was looking at witch stuff a couple of years ago, I watched the Christopher Lee 1960 movie, The City of the Dead. And some bad stuff takes place in a hotel in that one. And apparently, the movie was also known as Horror Motel or Horror Hotel, because I was looking it up earlier today because I was like, I'm pretty sure the woman, this young woman who's in college, goes to this town in New England where there supposedly was witchcraft stuff that happened to research it. And I remembered like her hotel room was part of it. Like the hotel was kind of connected to whatever bad things were happening. And when I looked it up earlier to remind myself to make sure I wasn't misremembering, I saw a thing that basically said the City of the Dead has also been called Horror Hotel. So I don't know how major it is. I don't know if a lot of people would know about it or it was as influential as Psycho. But I mean, it was a movie with Christopher Lee about like uh, a knockoff of the Salem witch trials history, I guess. And there is a creepy hotel, spoiler, run by people who might be connected to the bad stuff going on with witchcraft. So, like I said, I don't know if that's major enough for what you were asking, Lisa, but it's interesting that's around the time of Psycho and it involves a hotel.
Well, Mel, I was looking at a list of horror movies in particular that involve hotels, and uh, that was listed on there alongside Psycho and The Shining and several others as well. So, uh, I mean, it definitely fits. I have not seen it myself, so I don't want to comment too directly, but um, just saying that there are some, at least one other person out there on the internet with a website has also agrees. And, while on the subject, looking at the list of movies that have involved hotels is surprisingly slim. I mean, there's a lot out there, but they're not these iconic films that we've already talked about. I mean, we've mentioned Psycho, The Shining, 1408 to a lesser extent, etc. And so, I mean, honestly, in the film world, it does feel like there may be kind of a gap there. I know Lisa did mention Barbarian, which is a recent one and does involve the more recent trend of Airbnb style rentals. But yeah, just in my kind of armchair research, I was kind of surprised that there weren't more of these movies that involve hotels. So I guess that actually is probably a good place for us to kind of wind down this episode, at least as an introductory episode. There may not be a lot of movies, but we do have some interesting and good discussions planned for the next couple of episodes. We would not have done an actual series if we did not think that it was uh, a vein that was worth mining, if you will. But I think as far as a first episode, this might be a good place for us to go ahead and just kind of call it quits for now. So, listeners, if you can think of anything that we have left out, any glaring omissions, please let us know. We would love to hear from you. As always, we are at No Fearcast on Twitter and Instagram, and we also have a Facebook page. Our email is nofearcast@gmail.com. And if you love what we're doing, you can consider supporting us on Patreon. We also have merchandise available at our website, nofearcast.com. Or you can simply rate and review us. It's entirely free, but it does help other listeners find us. Theme music is by Nicholas Gasparini, and we will be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.